Hey, welcome back to the About the Labor podcast here at VikingsTerritory.com. I am BJ Reidell, back here with my guy, Drew Mahowald, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of different things here. So first and foremost, Kendall Wright is officially signed and under contract. We've seen those details come out per Ben Gessling in the Star Tribune. He's going to be playing on a $1 million contract with some incentive-based structure there. So the Vikings got another steal, it sounds like. So we'll talk a little bit about Kendall Wright and what he officially brings to the offense now that he's officially signed. After that, we'll jump into kind of we're going to be doing something a little bit different here. I'm trying to be creative here given the season. So this is smokescreen season, right? So we're going to play the same game. And we're going to talk about the Lions, the Bears, and the Packers, and we're going to talk about what those teams may be looking at in the draft. Because those are the primary competition for the Vikings. But the way that we're going to try to look at this here is from the vantage point of the Vikings. So, for example, just to give you kind of an idea of where we're going here, I have worked to figure out that the Bears are probably looking offensive tackle. I'm not a big fan of either of their current offensive tackles. So Connor Williams, for example, is a player that I have looked at for the Vikings specifically. And so from that standpoint, he might be a player that the Vikings might be interested in. And the Bears, I would assume, should also be interested in that type of player. So kind of the perspective that I want to look at this from, the angle that I want to look at this from is how the Vikings could get past the Bears in order to get a player like Connor Williams. So that's one example. I have a long list of notes here for each team, and we'll kind of do this for every single team in some capacity, and then we'll finish up with questions as always. So apologize for being a little bit delayed here. I got stuck doing health insurance for about 3 days in a row, so that's my excuse. That's why we're late here. On the bright side to that, the person that did my health insurance was Jalen Suggs' mother. So that was cool, and it gave me some inside info as to the type of kid that Jalen Suggs is, and the Minnehaha Academy product, and it's really no shock to me anymore why he is the way he is. So, all right, so let's jump into the Vikings here, starting with Kendall Wright. This is kind of what I've deduced, and then we'll let you kind of give your perspective here, Drew. Slot receiver, something that we've talked about on the last show. He's an extremely effective route runner. Specifically on those short and intermediate routes, I'm talking curls, slants, short crossing routes, stuff of that nature. I'm not saying that he doesn't run good vertical routes. I'm saying that he has not had success running those routes in terms of catches and targets. His targets have not always been great. I'm looking at Mitch Trubisky here a little bit. I'm not Bears fans that do listen to this show, I'm not saying your quarterback is bad. I'm saying that he was bad at throwing deep routes last season. I'm actually a really big fan of Mitch Trubisky at this point in his career, but he was not helpful to Kendall Wright's case. So that is kind of what I have gotten from watching the film on Kendall Wright. I checked out 3 games yesterday. I watched 2 of his poor performances and then also one of his better performances against the Cincinnati Bengals. And it looks to me like the Vikings got a steal here, not just in the sense of the contract, but also the level of talent here that this player presents to the Vikings organization. So, Drew, what are you seeing from Kendall Wright, and anything that you'd like to add to what we already talked about on the last show?
Yeah, I think that when the numbers came out of the contract, I was very impressed with how the Vikings were able to get essentially a Jarius Wright kind of replicate of and it was probably $3 million cheaper, something like that at least. I think Jarius Wright's cap hit this year would have been over $4 million, and Kendall Wright's is going to be $1 million. And so, I don't think there's a huge drop off, if any. I think they're relatively similar players. So I think the Vikings got a great deal here. They saved some cap room by essentially making a lateral move, probably, and that the overall level of play I think is pretty similar between Jarius and Kendall Wright. And I think you save $3 million, you get a guy that's excellent on the short intermediate routes, excellent out of the slot, and a guy that, like you said, he's not going to beat you for a 30 or 40 yard pass down the field. He's not the big enough or fast enough to kind of beat guys down the field. Usually you need to be either super fast or super big to kind of be effective there. But he's very savvy and shifty with his route running. and intermediate stuff, and that can be, very useful for the Vikings and for Kirk Cousins and those third down situations. So, I really like the move. I was very skeptical of letting Jarius Wright go just because of what he could bring to the table. But you can get essentially the same guy on $3 million cheap or less of a deal, and Jarius Wright fans with his jersey, you can keep the same one because he's wearing number 17. It makes all the sense in the world to me. So
I didn't even realize that they're both Kendall Wright is going to wear number 17 as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I saw Jarius Wright tweeted from his official account earlier today. He said something along the lines of "Don't bet against Jay Wright," which I loved because I look at that situation like this. Jarius Wright was put in a very difficult position. He was in a position where he's looking to cash in on what would be his third contract in the NFL. And as far as I'm concerned, he did. He got a very good deal relative to his value, and he's going to be playing with a hell of a quarterback in Cam Newton next year in Carolina. But the fact of the matter here is it certainly seems, based off of kind of what we have seen from Jarius Wright on Twitter and some of kind of the interviews and stuff that he has done, that he was very interested in returning to Minnesota, and it seems like the Vikings decided not to go in that direction. So that's disappointing for Jarius Wright fans out there. I know that there are a lot of them out there on Twitter. Specifically, he's one of those guys who was sort of an underdog in the Vikings system, and he became a fan favorite in a different way. Mr. First Down was something that I saw a lot. He was put in a very tough position here, and this is no knock on Kendall Wright. From my understanding, Jarius Wright is very happy for Kendall Wright. It's just more of kind of like I still wish that I was a Minnesota Viking as well. It's nothing against Kendall. It's just Jarius wants to play in Minnesota, or wanted to play in Minnesota, but now he's a Carolina Panther. So that's I've seen the pun used a lot that two rights don't make a wrong. I believe Sean Borman actually made that joke on Vikings territory. And I don't think there is a wrong answer here. I think the Vikings replaced Jarius Wright with Kendall Wright and did a very good job doing so. This is a cap situation as far as I'm concerned. There's not necessarily a player who is better of these two, but there is one player who is cheaper, and that is definitive at this point after seeing Kendall Wright's contract numbers. So tough situation for Jarius Wright fans. Very good situation for Kendall Wright. My next question to you, Drew, is kind of what can we expect from Kendall Wright in his first year in Minnesota? Now that he's set up here with Kirk Cousins, he's going to be playing in John DeFilippo's system. He's got two outside receivers in Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, assuming that he continues to be a slot receiver as he has been throughout his career. There's a lot of talent around Kendall Wright right now. Now, kind of my thought here is that might mean a smaller amount of targets for Kendall Wright, so that's something that he might have to kind of go through in his own head. He's been a number one receiver throughout most of his career. He received a lot of targets when he was with the Bears. Specifically in his best game against Cincinnati, he received 10 targets. So consider that here, because he's not going to be getting those type of numbers. But he is going to have a great opportunity to, be a very valuable asset to the Vikings organization. And he said himself that he was very impressed with the facilities. So he's going to have the opportunity to be playing and working in those facilities. So I think he set himself up for greatness here to kind of increase his role as he performs. But what do you see here from Kendall Wright in terms of what's going to happen starting next year?
Yeah, I mean, this actually is a question we got from our friend Mr. Mason on Twitter at @IKeepIt_SoReal.
So real.
There you go. There it is. Yep. Kendall Wright, he's just asking, statistically, catches, yards, touchdowns for the season. I think he's going to be a third receiver this year, and that's a lot of, I guess, third in terms of targets, and I think that's just because I haven't seen enough from Laquan Treadwell to believe that he's going to be that guy. And again, that's not that he won't or that he can't become that third guy behind Thielen and Diggs. It's just that I've seen more from Kendall Wright probably in his career as a slot guy than I have from Laquan Treadwell as any type of receiver at this point. So I'm going to stick Wright as the third receiver. Say he gets something like, 300 to 400 yards maybe. I think that'd be a pretty rock solid year for a third receiver in this offense. Given that I would assume that aggregate numbers are going to increase given Kirk Cousins, given hopefully a healthy Dalvin Cook. Something 300, 400 yards, a few touchdowns, something like that, I think would be a great year for Kendall Wright. Something close to like 40 to 50 catches. I think that's possible because in this offense, I think it's going to thrive this year. I think I saw the Good Morning Football show on NFL Network. They released a tweet or a segment on their show where they discussed, which offense is going to be the top offense in the NFL in 2018, and the top two choices were the Saints or the Vikings. Which
you're kidding me?
Yeah, I think they were debating the Saints or Vikings on the show. Which, I mean, there's other ones up there, but the fact that the Vikings are in consideration, given how much of how much defense is known, their brand is defense. Mike Zimmer's brand is defense. Yeah. I think a lot of that will benefit Kendall Wright. So I think statistically, I think he's going to be a third receiver. I think he's going to benefit a lot from, attention being paid to those other guys because you mentioned the talent around him. I think a lot of the time, the attention being paid to Thielen, to Diggs, to Kyle Rudolph, to Dalvin Cook is going to benefit him.
So we've talked a lot in the past about how space affects an NFL game, right? Ultimately the goal to me for an offensive coordinator is to try to get as many one-on-one matchups as possible, and then hope that your guy can beat the guy right across from him. That's really, to me, that's all you can ask from a coach. And what makes guys like Julio Jones so valuable is that he does automatically command that double team. If he's seeing man coverage directly across from him, he'll probably have the number one cornerback on him, and then he'll have a safety over the top in zone coverage to kind of like a half shell thing, right? So it's not necessarily one specific type of defense where, the way I like to explain it is that, in high school you're going to see a lot of very kind of simple coverages, right? If you're a fan of high school football, you're going to see a lot of like cover 2 or cover 1.
Yeah.
And it becomes it's very simple because these players they don't have the conditioning, they don't have the assets, they don't have everything in order to learn these kind of very intricate types of defenses that Mike Zimmer likes to run. And then when you get to the college level, you start seeing kind of this merger between both high school and the NFL, right? You start seeing some cover 2 with a little mix of cover 4 where it's split into two across the field, right? You'll see cover 2 on one side, cover 4 on the other, and then man coverage across the middle. It's a situation where there's so many different coverages going on where it's not just as simple as the Tampa 2 anymore. And that's why I give Leslie Frazier so much crap, is because if you run just a straight up Tampa 2 defense at this point in the NFL, it's just not going to work. You need to teach each guy how to do each thing. So this is why I like Kendall Wright so much. He beats the guy across from him. That's what he does. He's very, very technical route runner, very savvy, and he does a lot of things well, kind of from a body control standpoint, right? And so that starts with the head fakes. This is something we see Adam Thielen does very well. Stephon Diggs also does this well. Also, it's just kind of manipulating the guy in front of you. And to me, that's a product of watching a lot of film. You kind of you try to guess the opposite of what the guy across from you is going to do. So smarter cornerbacks are going to anticipate kind of what the guy is going to do. And what I mean by the word smarter is I mean more experienced, to be honest with you. It's just guys that watch more film tend to be able to anticipate better than others. You look at guys like Marcus Peters, for example. It's pretty damn clear that guy knows who he's going up against every single week, and that's why he's a number one cornerback. So this is, again, I'm getting a little off subject here, but I'm trying to come back to a simple point here that Kendall Wright is a guy that's going to get one-on-one matchups now because he's playing with Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. And what that does for the Vikings is that he can run those short routes very well and those intermediate routes really well. And he doesn't even necessarily need to run those streaks, those fly routes, those 9 routes, as people like to call them. Doesn't even need to do that anymore. Now, he probably will at different points in time in order to kind of mess with the defense a little bit. But his job now is to be a slot receiver for the Vikings, as far as I am concerned. That's my understanding right now. Yeah, this is a guy that's going to be – he's set up for success here in Minnesota. And, I don't necessarily know at this point what's going to happen with Treadwell. Like you were talking before, I don't think that the Treadwell Wright thing is connected in any way, right? I don't see the connection there because Treadwell is still an outside receiver. I don't think that this is like a, I've seen people say that this is kind of like an alarm for Treadwell, like, hey, get your stuff together. I don't think that's what this is. I think that this is just, hey, we added another asset to the Vikings receiving core, and Treadwell's
it's replacing Jarius Wright. That's what it is.
That's what it is. It's not.
Jarius Wright couldn't. They couldn't either. They felt like they couldn't afford Jarius Wright, or he felt he had a better opportunity in Carolina. Whatever the case was, so they found a guy that was very similar to his skill set and replaced him in an offense that was successful last year and will likely only get better due to John DeFilippo, Kirk Cousins now coming into town.
Right.
That's what they did. They added a slot guy and Kendall Wright. It just happens to have the same last name and same jersey.
Yeah. So that's probably a good spot to end the Kendall Wright discussion for now. But simple point here, kind of to wrap all this up, from what I'm getting from Drew and what I'm telling you from myself, this is a very good signing for the Vikings. It's a very affordable signing. It's a very valuable asset that the Vikings just brought in for John DeFilippo's system specifically, and it's an opportunity for Kendall Wright to continue his career and really be that that first round pick that he was coming out of Baylor now. It's a very good situation for both the Vikings and Wright. So everything worked out here. Just another one of those weird things where Minnesota is having some nice things every once in a while. So from there, let's jump into this discussion here about the NFC North specifically. And I think the best way to start here is to look at the offensive line now, because as far as I am concerned, the offensive line has to be a priority for the Vikings now. It's very...
Yep.
The Vikings haven't necessarily telegraphed this. It's just if you deduce every move they have made, offensive line has to be a priority at this point in time. I don't care if it's offensive tackle. I don't care if it's guard. I don't care if it's center. Offensive line has to be a priority. Now, this is what I have seen from – these are my notes, and then Drew, I'll get your perspective on it after we go through this here. But the Lions, Kenny Wiggins is at guard. Not really a fan of his game, and to be honest with you, I don't really know who he is. I've never watched his film before. So the Lions should be looking guard, or not necessarily should be looking guard, but they might be looking guard. The Bears, offensive tackle, they need a blindside protector for Mitch Trubisky. They need someone who is better. Right? I'm not saying that the guys that they have in there now are bad, but I am saying that if you want your franchise quarterback to be great, you need a Tyrone Smith. You need a Riley Reif. You need a Trent Williams. You need a left tackle that's going to be able to stop these elite edge rushers. So offensive tackle should be a priority for the Bears. Guard also. Now, people are going to look at that and they're going to say, oh, well, what about Kyle Long, man? And I'm going to say to you, well, what about the guy playing opposite Kyle Long? Games are won in the trenches. That's where it starts. So I think that the Bears have to be looking both tackle and guard. So I would keep an eye on both of those positions for both of those teams. And then let me get to the Packers here, who are one of the most complete offensive lines in the NFL as far as I'm concerned. The offensive tackle position is very good, but the guard position is not necessarily great. I'm looking at Justin McCray specifically here. The term I use to describe him is weak. And that's not a knock on him specifically from a football standpoint. It's not.
You just called him weak.
I'm not saying he's weak from a physical standpoint. I'm saying that his relative to the rest of the NFL, Justin McCray is not a top-notch guard. And I know that the Packers love their offensive line because I know that they love protecting Aaron Rodgers, right? That's not something that needs to be sourced. That is just fact. No. They want to protect the quarterback, and offensive tackle is a position they have put a lot of money and assets into, money and resources into. Now, Corey Linsley, their center, is a 6th-round pick, so they found kind of a gem there. But the two guards are positions that could potentially be upgraded as well. So, what are you seeing here? Am I finding truth here, or what's your perspective on the offensive lines in the NFC North division?
Yeah, I would say the Bears and the Vikings both have offensive line as a whole kind of really high on their priority list. You have, I guess they've both invested quite a bit into their quarterback situation recently. You get a 1st-round pick last year, Mitch Trubisky for Chicago, and then now you have the richest contract in NFL history for Kirk Cousins. You got to keep both those guys healthy if you're either Chicago or Minnesota. So, I mean, keeping them healthy, obviously a big priority for both of them, and I would agree that for the Bears especially that there's guard and tackle can both be upgraded. I would say Green Bay is totally, they're set. My gosh, I got something in my throat. They're set, though. David Bakhtiari is one of the best tackles in the NFL. We know that. And Aaron Rodgers doesn't even need the elite offensive line sometimes. And I'm not going to get on a tangent here about Aaron Rodgers and how great he is.
Are you sure you're not? I think you might.
I'm not. I will sustain.
I think you might.
I will abstain. But Detroit, I think they could also afford just a little bit of a boost as well. I think the thing is, offensive line is kind of like defensive back, where you can never really have too much depth.
Sure.
So I think Detroit could afford to add some, especially on the interior. But I think for sure Chicago and Minnesota are going to have to target those guys really high in the draft. You look at even I'm not Quentin Nelson, excuse me, probably won't drop very far, but he might be an option for Chicago depending on if he does drop to I don't even know what Chicago's picking, to be honest. But and then obviously Isaiah Wynn's getting a lot of attention as a kind of mid-round first round guard in the middle of the first round. Other guys in the second round, maybe Austin Corbett from Nevada is another one. Obviously Billy Price is the guy I like. So those players will be targeted, I think, both by Chicago and Minnesota here as draft season kind of heats up, because again, I think both teams could afford a lot of improvement of offensive line.
Absolutely. I think that the Bears are probably the team to be most afraid of here relative to the NFC North in terms of kind of trying to get offensive linemen. And again,
take offensive linemen from the Vikings.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Because I think that the Vikings, again, the Vikings need offensive linemen. It's not I love Riley Reif. I think that Riley Reif is a cornerstone left tackle. I believe that he proved that last season. And I believe that Pat Elflein is a cornerstone center based off what I was able to see from him and kind of his ability to read the field and get out in front of running backs and just everything that he's able to do from that center position. I also like Mike Remmers, but I don't know how much I love Mike Remmers. I think that he's a player that you can upgrade from. I think that he's a great piece and he's a very affordable asset for the Vikings, but he's not elite. And if the goal is to make everything as elite as possible, right? Like that's the goal. It's not to say that Remmers isn't good. He is good, but he's not elite. And if the goal is to be elite, then you have to look at whether you consider him to be an offensive tackle or a guard. Mike Zimmer has kind of been wishy-washy on that whole thing. If you consider him an offensive tackle, then Connor Williams, for example, is a guy that you should be looking at to play right tackle opposite Riley Reif. And it becomes a competition thing, like you said with defensive backs. You can never have enough good offensive linemen, and it's not a knock on Danny Isidora. I was very impressed with him as well, but he's not elite, or at least not yet. He might be someday, but I'm still looking at James Daniels regardless. It's not because I don't think that Isidora can step up and improve. I saw very good things from him as a run blocker, but this offense seems to be moving towards more pass protection now with DiFilippo being installed, Kirk Cousins coming in there. I'm expecting to see a 50-50 balance now, or maybe even a 60-40 balance in favor of the pass. And that's not because I don't think that this is a run-first team still, that the mentality is still there as far as Mike Zimmer is concerned. You still got Dalvin Cook. But ultimately what John DiFilippo likes to do is have balance and keep everyone off balance, right? And what Dalvin Cook is able to do is that. He can run between the tackles well. He can catch the ball in the backfield well. He's just extremely talented in that regard. So I look at the way the direction this offense is moving, and I say to myself, it has to be offensive line for the Vikings in the draft in maybe the first, second, and third round. Hell, I don't like...
that wouldn't upset me, that's for sure.
It shouldn't upset you. So I'm looking at the Chicago Bears as the team in the NFC North division specifically that the Vikings should have to leapfrog in order to get a guy like Connor Williams or in order to get a guy like Quentin Nelson. If you want elite assets at those two positions, those are two guys that I believe to be at the top of their position in this draft class. That's what you're going to need.
Yeah, I think so. I think looking at these other teams here and kind of their needs, but Green Bay, obviously the defensive back is going to be a huge priority for them, just because they've lost what now? They traded Marius Randall. They tried to get Kyle Fuller from the Bears, and they did not do so successfully. So they, I would be shocked if they didn't go defensive back with their first pick. Probably somebody like Josh Jackson from Iowa, if they can find a way to get him. That's probably their dream scenario. Obviously, there's a bunch of other options out there. Mike Hughes from Central Florida is one of them. But, the Packers need defensive backs, and they also, this might be a kind of a reach a little bit, but at receiver, I think they could afford to bring in another weapon to kind of replace Jordy Nelson, just because, now you got a lot of pressure on Devontae Adams to be a true number one. Randall Cobb is Randall Cobb in the slot, but you don't have that other kind of outside receiver there. They could maybe afford to spend a pick on someone to step up and take that spot. Otherwise, you have, I think, Geronimo Allison or some weird name out there. So that's what the Packers, I think, might do. They might target receivers kind of higher than you might expect. And the Bears, I think, at linebacker, inside linebacker in their 3-4, they lost Terrell Freeman. And not that he had been playing a lot of games lately, just because of suspensions and injuries and other things, but they need to find someone to play next to Danny Trevathan in there to kind of fortify that defense that does have a lot of talent. So I think Bears going inside linebacker somewhat early and Packers going receiver somewhat early are kind of a couple things to look for.
Yeah, let's jump into that Packers cornerback scenario because I think that defensive back is probably that's probably the number 2 need for the Vikings. That's kind of that's the vantage point that I'm looking at it from. You look at Terrence Newman's situation and him kind of being up in the air right now. I think that defensive back has to be a priority for the Vikings, and I definitely think that defensive back should be a priority for the Packers. Until that situation is resolved.
I mean, they have like 3 cornerbacks on the roster, right now, total. Did they bring back Jermone Williams or something like that? I think they brought him back. How old is he now? He's been
30.
He's been around for a long
30
time.
Something. He's been around for a while.
Terrence Newman's like 100, but he's still better than Jermone Williams. So
he is, and so I look at these are what my notes read. Quentin Rollins is a guy that I like, but he's a slot cornerback as far as I'm concerned. He's not an outside cornerback. He's not a traveling cornerback. He's not a Patrick Peterson type. He's more of a Mackenzie Alexander type. That's how I would explain that. And then Kevin King with the Washington product. I'm a huge Kevin King fan. I believe he's going to be great. He's not yet, but I really believe this. I love Washington cornerbacks. Marcus Peters is another Washington cornerback that I really like. They do a hell of a job at Washington figuring out the cornerback.
Sidney Jones, too.
Oh, yeah, just the Richard Sherman body double, basically there. I think that Kevin King is going to be a hell of a player, but he is unproven right now. So I would continue to draft cornerback. The Packers need to figure out their secondary. I don't.
That's correct. That is correct.
I don't care who your general manager is. I don't care who your defensive coordinator is. I don't care who's calling the shots, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, Ted Thompson, who's hopefully not calling any shots for anyone, you need to figure out your secondary if you want to be competitive in this NFL. That's how it works now. And I think that they have taken good steps towards doing that with drafting guys like Kevin King. But sometimes you just need to keep going until it's fixed. So I think the Packers need to be looking cornerback, and I think they need to also be looking safety here. I like their safeties too. Josh Jones is another guy that I think could be very good. At some point in his career. But again, I would drive the competition. If I'm Green Bay, I would continue to draft defensive backs until you've got that situation resolved. That's what I would do.
Especially now when you have Kirk Cousins coming into the NFC North, you have Matt Stafford who's already slinging the ball everywhere, about 50 times a game in Detroit, and an up and coming first rounder Mitch Trubisky in the division. There's already a need just because of the nature of the NFL now moving into kind of a passing league more and more. Already you need to have that secondary to rely on in the back, behind your pass rushers. But especially now with all the firepower in the NFC North for all these passing teams, more than ever, you got to keep up because you can't, that's a lot of pressure to put on Aaron Rodgers to put up 40 points a game when your secondary can't stop a nosebleed.
Right. I liked that. That was good. So cornerback should be, the Packers are probably an obstacle for the Vikings in terms of, trying to get that position filled, or not necessarily like a starter. But, I do think the Vikings can relax a bit at the cornerback position or the safety position just because you can get one in the first, second, third, or fourth round. Cameron Kelly from San Diego State is a guy that I have my eye on specifically. Sure. I like him a lot. I've been watching his film. He's not necessarily a very well-known name, but he's a player that I really like based off his build and kind of his flaws are things that I think are fixable. For example, he ran a 4.66 40-yard dash. I think that's very fixable because I don't think that straight line speed necessarily matters all that much, assuming that you can get your hands on a guy at the line of scrimmage, which I think Cameron Kelly can. So that's a guy that I would look at for the Vikings. I don't think that he fits what the Packers are trying to do because they don't know what they're doing in their secondary, straight up. So
no cornerbacks fit what the Packers are doing. They shouldn't even draft them. They should just go out there with 2 defensive backs every week.
I don't know what I love the Vikings. I love the state of Minnesota. But I can be objective here, and I can tell you that I don't understand what the Packers are doing on defense. I don't. I'm trying to understand, and I don't get it. So let's wrap this thing up here with the final position that I believe is still kind of a need for the Vikings. That's linebacker or edge rusher, technically. Again, I'm obsessed with coverage linebackers. You guys, the people that have been listening to the show for a long time, you guys are aware of this. Guys like Shaq Thompson. I have a fascination with them. I think they're they're some of the most talented players in the entire NFL because of what they're asked to do. So, Thomas Davis is probably the shining example of this, the brightest example of this type of player. A guy that can really move sideline to sideline well, can also play zone coverage well, and can go heads up on a slot receiver. That's the type of player that I think the Vikings have to be looking for at the linebacker position, just so you don't have to ask Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks to do so much all the time. So I don't really see any team in the NFC North that could use a player like that based off of their defensive schemes. Now, the Packers have Clay Matthews, who is not good at football anymore, and that needs to be concrete. He is an edge rusher. He is a pass rushing linebacker, and he's not that good at pass rushing anymore. He's not very good at being a middle linebacker. He's just not that good anymore. He is a player who has built an incredible resume through what he has done throughout his career to date, but at this point in time, he is a guy that probably needs to be replaced in the near future. The Packers might be looking linebacker here. I would look at the Lions as well, but they're looking more, I think, in kind of an edge rusher standpoint. They got their coverage linebacker last year in Jalen Reeves-Maybin, and as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. I don't know if the Lions feel that way, but that's how I feel. But I would look at them as well. And then I would, I think the Bears have maybe the best linebacker core in the NFL between Jarrell Freeman, who is always suspended for something, and then Danny Trevathan, who is just incredible at what he does being a downhill linebacker. I really like what the Bears do at the linebacker position, but I think the Lions and the Packers are two teams that I would keep an eye on specifically, just because I don't necessarily know what the Lions would look for, because I don't, again, their defense is a little bit foreign to me, but the Packers specifically, you just need to add talent at this point on your defense. It's not personal. This has nothing to do with the fact that Minnesotans generally hate Wisconsin stuff. This is about the fact that the Packers defense is trash. That's what this is about.
Yeah, I mean, they've taken some steps to kind of figure that out, and I think they have some pieces on that. I mean, Blake Martinez, that linebacker, obviously, right. As one of their starters, he's a stud, I think. So at least there you have a kind of a cornerstone player at the position, whereas a defensive back, they have nothing. They have an unproven rookie. They have an older veteran guy that hasn't played well in years, and Tremont Williams. So I think, I think the Packers are so in need of defensive backs that I think they're going to almost stray from linebacker. Not that they won't draft a linebacker, but I think it's to the point where they cannot afford to go linebacker as the priority above defensive back. And I said the Bears, they might go and try and find a starter to, slide in next to Dan Trevathan in that inside of the 3-4. So I think that's possible. But yeah, I mean, I think the Vikings can also afford some depth guys, some rangy cover guys as well, kind of to counter, because Ben Gideon's more of a run-stopping player.
Sure.
So maybe another guy as kind of a depth guy that can be rangy, cover. Anthony Barr light, I guess. I mean, obviously his kind of mold of play style. There's a couple guys out there. I, for one, am very intrigued by Shaquem Griffin just because his story is phenomenal.
Of course.
I'm going to bring up that name. Just I can't not bring up that name. Malik Jefferson out of Texas, big, huge guy. I think he's got some serious potential as well. I was also a Fairweather Texas fan growing up, so Vince Young had me hooked for a little bit there, and then I drifted away when they started being bad. But Sky Moore, another one. I think there's a few guys that are potential depth guys. I don't see anybody coming in and starting like ahead of Ben Gideon in the 4-3 right away, just because I don't think the Vikings will go linebacker very high, but I think they will find a guy in the 4th, 5th round, kind of as another depth guy initially, like their plan was with Ben Gideon before he won the starting job.
Absolutely. All right, so that's about all I've got from the NFC North perspective here relative to the draft and the positions that the Vikings are looking at, or probably looking at, or should be looking at. I don't care. One of those words, one of those phrases, something like that. So from there, let's jump into the questions here and finish up the show for today.
Yeah, I think we got 3 of them, I believe, because we answered one already about Kendall Wright. So from Eli at Skolesies, who would have to fall in the draft, and how far would they have to fall for you to consider a first-round trade-up? What would you be willing to give up for a guy like Quentin Nelson if he were to fall into like the mid-first round? So, what are you thinking here?
Quentin Nelson is definitely the guy that I would trade up for. If I was a general manager on most teams, I would look at Quentin Nelson. I would look at the body of work. I would look at the college that he comes from. I would look at kind of the physique, his physical size, his ability, his mentality based off of the interviews and kind of the information that has been released on him, the quotations that have been sourced from national reporters and local reporters, and just in general, Notre Dame kids. Man, Notre Dame has
a lot of them on the Vikings roster,
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely the guy that I would trade up for. I don't care necessarily what team you are. I believe this guy has Zach Martin pedigree. Zach Martin being the very, very, very talented guard from the Dallas Cowboys organization. And you've seen what the Cowboys have been able to do in terms of improving their running game with good offensive line, and then also giving Dak Prescott kind of room to work just by having good protection. And then you also saw how quickly that fell off the cliff when Tyrone Smith got hurt and things started to kind of fall apart. So I really think that, people always use this phrase. I shouldn't say people always do this, but I see this often. Where people say, the offensive line is the MVP. You can't do that. That's not how it works. You have to give one player because it's most valuable player, not most valuable players, plural. So I look at a guy like Quentin Nelson who has the potential to be an MVP caliber player in terms of blocking the run. So that is definitely the guy that I would trade up for. I would give up a lot. If the Vikings are sitting at number 30, I would be willing to give up the number 30 pick. I would probably give up my second round pick, and then I would give up a couple of those conditional picks that the Vikings have coming in next year, maybe 2 of them, to move up to, say, 8. I would give up a lot of assets to get this kid.
Yeah. That wouldn't even be enough, I don't think. I mean, you'd have to give up probably one of your asset, one of your key assets, young players that have potential. I think one of those guys that's going to be due for an extension. You might have to give up one of those guys to get Quentin Nelson. But yeah, he's the guy you're going to trade up for, I think, as well. I don't see it happening. You're going to need something like the Laramie Tunsil mask thing from a couple years ago. that you're going to need something like that with Quentin Nelson for him to drop, because I just don't see it happening. But it's a fun hypothetical to think about, because
and that's exactly what it is. It's a hypothetical situation. And honestly, it's smokescreen season, and we're dealing with Rick Spielman here, who is as tight-lipped as they come. And Mike Zimmer is the perfect complement to that, in the sense that he'll say whatever the hell he wants, and only some of it might be true, or all of it might be true. That's the dynamic that we deal with here in Minnesota, in the sense that Rick Spielman knows what he wants, and he's not going to tell you what he wants until he gets what he wants. So if he wants Quentin Nelson, he's not going to tell you guys.
We remember last year during how many of those running backs the Vikings were supposedly interested in. They were heavily interested in Joe Mixon, supposedly, right? I think maybe Alvin Kamara they were supposedly interested in. And then draft day comes. We hadn't heard a word about them being interested in Dalvin Cook, and then they trade up for him. So, and they did that. They did so ahead of Joe Mixon.
Who apparently they were more interested in, again, like you said, than anyone else. Those were the reports that we got from, again, very, very credible reporters. Like, I'm telling you guys, it's not. There's so much, quote, news arguments going on, specifically on Twitter. Twitter is just a mess. But what I'm trying to tell you is that even the best reporters, they don't know everything. They try really, really hard, and they work really hard.
They relay what they're told.
And that's what they're supposed to do.
Sometimes they're told the wrong thing. Sometimes the team shares information that's not correct on purpose.
It's like people just don't get that. And I have been trying to explain this to you guys for 170 episodes now. The Vikings they operate the right way. They operate to win. They operate to win football games. And what do you want more? Do you want to win, or do you want to know right now what the Vikings are going to do in a couple of weeks? What matters more to you, folks? Do you care if they win next football season, or do you care about knowing right now in this moment what's going to happen? What's more important to you? I really, really hope that your answer is winning football games next season, because that's what Rick Spielman tries to do. That's what Mike Zimmer tries to do. That's what this organization tries to do. That's what they're built on. So when there's a bunch of news circulating, and some you see a national reporter or a local reporter get something not necessarily incorrect, but let's say they're ambiguous about it, they're doing their job. That's the words that were used. So stop. I just don't understand why people give reporters so much hell for trying really hard just to get the answer right in the moment, because that's all they can do. That's their job, folks. I don't care if you're national media, if you're local media, or if you're a blogger. The job is to get the thing right in the moment, and people just straight up, they get pissed off about it. Welcome to the NFL, folks. That's how it works. So that is my rant on that question.
Yeah, that's the aside rant from BJ Reidell on the show. We'll get to the next question from Joshua at Norseman Josh. This is kind of the question that it's nice for us to answer every 2 to 3 weeks, just because leading up to the draft, things change, our mindsets change. Who would you want the Vikings to take at 30? With how the current roster is, would you do best player available, or would you trade back?
Best
what are you
player
thinking
available.
right now?
Best player available. Yeah, that's what I would do. I would look at my draft board, which I do not have a draft board, and I would say, okay, who's the best player? And I would take that guy. That would be the best available player, and I would add him to my football team. That's what I would do.
Okay. Now I'm going to do this differently, because I'm going to look at you need a lineman. So you're going to go – the Vikings need a lineman. You're going to go probably interior linemen. So I'm going to look at, Frank Ragnow, James Daniels, Billy Price, Will Hernandez. If there's multiple of those guys available at 30, maybe Isaiah Wynn drops. I doubt it. But if there's 3 or 4 of those guys available at 30, then you trade back, because you're going to get more picks, and you're also going to likely get one of those guys still. And I think either one of those, any of those 4 guys can be a starter right away. So that's what I would do. I would see what the status for those guys in particular is. If there's only 1 or 2 of them left, you draft one. If not, you trade back, you get one still, and add more picks.
Sure.
Last one here from Riley at Riley Vole on Twitter. How high in the draft do you think a rotational defensive end should be taken?
Rotational defensive end.
Yeah. So like the next Daniil Hunter, I guess, or another guy like Brian Robinson, the Tayshaun Bauer, maybe somebody like that.
Okay, I'm gonna use history here. I'm gonna use Scott Crichton as the example. I would also be willing to use Daniil Hunter as the example here. The reason why I'm not going to use Daniil Hunter is because he is elevated to being a starter, whereas Scott Crichton was a guy who was always just a rotational guy that just never panned out. So the way that the Vikings went about that, as far as I am concerned, is they were looking for a pass rusher to complement what they had already in Brian Robinson and Everson Griffin, and they took him in the 3rd round. I understood the pick at the time because he's an extremely athletic player. It wasn't a player that I loved. He didn't jump off. I don't want to say he didn't jump off the tape because he was talented, and some of this is hindsight bias speaking. But, I think that to ramp up to my point here without going too far on this, I would say that the 3rd round is probably the place to get a good quality rotational defensive end that can also become a starter down the line. Dependent, you want your rotational guys to have the capacity to start, right? Just in case someone goes down. So I would say 3rd round is probably the round to go for there.
Yeah, that's probably correct. There's another guy from LSU that could be a 3rd rounder, Arden Key.
Ooh.
Arden Key. But
he's dropped. Is he really in 3rd round range now?
I'm looking. My source right now I'm looking at is the CBS Sports rankings. He's a 72nd ranked player on their board.
Okay, that's Dane Brugler, so he does a hell of a job. So I would take that very seriously.
So he's got him 72. I mean, again, I haven't watched Arden Key, but I know he's a big dude, and he has fallen a little bit. So who knows? It's one possibility. I mean, Daniil Hunter was an LSU guy that had not a ton of, I guess, NFL traits shown on film. It was more about the physical measurables from Daniil Hunter. So anyway, we'll see. But I agree that a mid 3rd, 4th round is probably where you want that annual defensive end pass rusher rotational guy draft pick this year.
Absolutely. All right, folks, that is the show for today. Thanks as always for your patience with us not being able to get our thing up on Monday. Again, that's on me, and we will be back later on this week. I do not know what we're going to talk about. Like I have zero idea at this point.
Maybe the Vikings.
Probably the Vikings. Yeah, that's probably what we'll talk about. So looking forward to doing that, and we will catch you guys later on this week.